Welcome to Third Thursday. Hello, I'm Donna Owens, Program Director of the OCALI Family Center. Each month we present a web stream broadcast on a topic of interest to parents of children and adults with autism spectrum disorder and other developmental disabilities. Each broadcast is recorded and archived on our Family Center webpage, and it can be viewed at any time. We've covered topics from tools for transition planning to understanding standards-based education for learners with cognitive disabilities. To see a list of all our Third Thursday broadcasts, click on the Family Center webpage Third Thursday icon, and you can see them listed there. If you see something there that you think another family would be interested in, please refer them to our Third Thursday so they can learn about a topic as well. Today's topic is sensory issues, what parents need to know. We're all bombarded by sensory input every day. Everything from the sun coming through our window in the morning to the smell of coffee coming from the kitchen, a garbage truck growling outside, a dog barking across the street. All of this and more is happening at the same time. While we take in this collection of sights and sounds and smells and other stimuli, we learn to ignore what's not important and to attend to what is important to us. That is our sensory system at work. It's a complex process, and we're going to learn more about it today. We're also going to learn about how children may behave when they're experiencing challenges with sensory issues and are having difficulty regulating their responses to sensory stimuli. I'm interviewing Denise Swan Caruso. She's an OCALI regional consultant and one of our Family Center team members. She's a speech-language pathologist who is trained and consulted with schools across Ohio and with many county boards of developmental disabilities, as well as consulted with parents and family members to support children with complex needs. And often, some of the issues a child's team may deal with will be sensory issues and sensory challenges, which may precipitate some of the behavior that we see in children. Is that not right, Denise?
Absolutely, Donna.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So, Denise is going to give us an overview of the sensory system and talk to us about how sensory challenges may be reflected in a child's behavior. Thank you, Denise, for being here with me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you for asking.
Okay, so now we know that our sensory system is a complex system, and we want to come to a kind of a better understanding about it today. What are we referring to when we're talking about sensory issues, sensory challenges, and our sensory needs?
Well, basically, sensory processing is where you take information in through all of your sensory systems. You have 7 systems.
Mm-hmm.
You interpret the information, and then you develop a response based on the sensory stimuli. Basically, it's taking information in through your eyes, through your ears, through touch, through movement. Then you determine what you're going to do with that information, and then you come up with an action.
Okay. All right. So there are kind of 3 steps to that process then. The first is the taking in. The second then is the interpreting what it is you've taken in. And then the third is preparing your response when you're going to respond to it.
Correct. And as you said, Donna, we're bombarded all day long with single and multiple sensory input through our sensory systems. So you have to be able to manage and deal with things that sometimes are uncomfortable to you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. And so what are the function then of our responses? What's the function of our sensory system then?
It helps us to maintain a balance.
Mm-hmm.
It helps us to really organize ourselves to deal with things that are uncomfortable. So we all have sensory sensitivities. It could be that you have foods that you don't like, the taste of foods, or you may have sounds that are upsetting to you, or you can't get into something that revolves in a circle or takes you up and down like a roller coaster.
Mm-hmm.
When you are experiencing those events, you have to manage your body so that you can achieve some kind of balance. And that balance is called homeostasis.
Okay, so when children are in school, all these sensory stimuli might be surrounding other kids, talking, writing, doing whatever, and the teacher also may be talking at the same time. Now, what's important in that environment is for a child would be what the teacher is saying. but there are other things going on that may interfere with that at some time, other sensory
Correct.
input?
Correct. So I'm in the classroom, and the teacher's talking. So now I'm getting input auditorily. Then the students are moving around the classroom, so there's all these visual distractions.
Right.
Then she asks the students to look at, let's say, a smart board. So now I'm taking another visual piece. Then I have to pick up a pencil or a pen or some writing utensil. Then I have to use it to do something tactile. So all of a sudden I have to determine what is going to be, what am I going to choose to do?
Right.
Because I'm struggling. So classrooms can be very, very difficult for students who have sensory processing.
Well, as we talk about it, I can see how it would be difficult for students to be able to identify, this is what I'm supposed to respond to when something else maybe more interesting is happening beside me or behind me or whatever. But this balance then that you're talking about, the homeostasis, when they're in that balance, when we are in that balance, are we then able to prioritize what we should be responding to?
Sometimes we can. Sometimes we engage in a particular behavior that may be viewed as unusual to manage my body. So, for example, if you are in a room and the temperature changes in the room, and so the first thing you might do is if you have a sweater on and it gets very hot, you might take your sweater off. That's a really appropriate response.
Right.
But for a child or an adult who doesn't know what to do when the temperature changes, they may engage in unusual behavior like hand flapping or maybe crawl underneath a chair or actually get up and leave a room. So some of their behaviors may be misinterpreted as being a behavior, but really it's a response to the sensory.
It's trying to protect their system, to keep their system
Correct.
in balance.
Correct.
And then, right, okay. Yes, and that makes sense to me. That's like when you're sitting in in a lecture, and you may be even really interested in what the person's saying, but the chair gets hard and you find yourself squirming around, or you'll cross your legs or uncross your legs. That's a mechanism that you're kind of unconsciously doing it, but it's a mechanism to make yourself more comfortable so you can attend.
Exactly. And you've done presentations before, and you'll have a person who'll come up to you and say, now, don't worry, I'm going to stand up frequently throughout the day because I really can't sit that long.
Yes, I have.
So that's managing your sensory system.
Okay, right. So, and we all have sensory preferences, as you mentioned, and those things can be very acute for some and then maybe not so important for others. I know sometimes the feel of clothing can be a real issue for parents in getting children dressed in the morning, and so we're talking about sensory issues when we're even talking about clothing that we wear or perfume or that a teacher may wear.
And remember, you're being bombarded all day long with all kinds of sensory experiences. So you may have children or adults who like to be barefoot, or you may have children or adults who won't wear coats, no matter how cold it is, and they may love to roll themselves in the snow. So we see all these kinds of unusual behaviors because the individual is trying to manage their sensory system.
Gotcha. Okay, so now let's go through. You said we have 7 senses,
Yes.
and I'll let that go at that point. I do know that we have 7 senses, and let's talk about the first 5 senses, the one that we're most familiar with. And so can you kind of take us through those 5 familiar senses then and talk to us about each one?
Yes, so the first 5 familiar senses we learned very early in school, and it has to do with sound or auditory. It has to do with sight or vision, smell or olfactory, taste or gustatory, or tactile touch. So those are 5 things that we're very aware of. But we have 2 unfamiliar senses that are called proprioception and vestibular. As we begin to talk about the sensory systems, I'll give you some examples for each one.
So let's talk about each of the senses individually then. And you'll also talk to us about the behaviors we might see if a child is experiencing some difficulty with that particular sensory system. So shall we start with the auditory system? Can you tell us about the auditory system?
Yes, so your auditory hearing system is obviously taking sound vibrations in through the mechanisms in the ear, and it actually interprets sounds, speech, music, anything that is coming in through those mechanisms. And you want to be aware that oftentimes, with all of our sensory systems, sometimes you'll have an over or hyper reaction or an under or hypo reaction. And it's going to be the observation of the child or adult as to whether they're overly responding or under responsive. And some of the characteristics that you might see is that the individual will become focused on a sound that's very consistent, like the whirring of a fan.
Right.
Also, even though we can't hear it, there's this imperceptible sound that comes with overhead lighting, because you think about the classroom.
Right.
It can be very distracting. They may also be responsive to a sound that's unusual. So we oftentimes have to prepare children for tornado drills or fire drills. So anything, or even the screeching of, let's say, a fire truck or an ambulance.
Right, yes.
So those might be some of the observations that you might.
Right, and so let's be clear, we're not just talking about words with auditory, we're talking about any noise or hearing stimuli, not just words, not just what people say.
Even for some individuals, the voice of a female versus the voice of a male. So sometimes, since the woman's pitch is higher, some individuals respond better to a male voice.
And we do know that there are people who have voices that we like and that we don't like, and in terms of quality and voice. But it can be a much bigger challenge for some than others, as what it comes down to. Okay, so, and you've talked about the auditory system, and you've talked about some of the behaviors that children might react to, or that we might see reflected in a child's behavior. Can we go on and then talk about the visual system?
Absolutely. So sight vision, obviously, is information taken in through the structures of the eye.
Right.
And it provides us awareness of our surroundings. It allows us to look at distance and proximity and depth perception. And so some of the characteristics you might see, if a behavior you might observe, is that you might find the individual is attracted to shiny lights.
Right.
I had a young man who used to run around cars, and he used to love to see his reflection and the movement in a shiny object, and that was one way that he would run around cars and calm himself down, by looking at himself.
Right.
Or you may find that they line up items or objects in a very, very similar fashion. So it could be anything, blocks, it could be cups, it could be silverware, but they line it up, and if you move any item or object out of that position, they get very upset.
Right, right.
They may cover their eyes if it's something that is really difficult for them to look at.
Right, yeah, like we do when we're in sun that's too bright.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly.
It's kind of an automatic response then, too.
And this also affects oftentimes eye contact, because sometimes the face changes frequently. And so it's really difficult for the individual to read the face. And so they may avert their eye gaze and use their peripheral vision.
Right, right. I've heard individuals with autism talk about being uncomfortable making eye contact, direct eye contact with individuals when they're holding a conversation. And in fact, and what they've said is, I can't listen to you if I have to look at you. You know, and I know a man has 2 master's degrees, and he said, I can't attend to you if I have to look at you. When I hear you talk, I need to look. You know, I need to look to the side because it's too much stimulation. So that's exactly what you're talking about.
If you understand that, then you're not going to demand that the individual look at you.
Right.
And that also would certainly happen if you're in a restaurant and you want the individual to look at let's say, the wait staff.
Right.
And to look directly in order, and that may be too hard for them. Or in school, looking directly at the teacher or the paraprofessional would be difficult. So averting eye gaze could be a behavior that's misinterpreted.
Yeah, and it's an adaptive response. It's helping them keep their sensory system balanced in a way that's comfortable for them.
Absolutely.
You made another point that I want to go back to, in the example that you mentioned about the little boy that would run around the car and see his reflection, and that was a calming activity for him. And we can often see kids on the spectrum who will do finger flapping or finger this in front of their eyes, and that makes me think that may be a calming response for them. And they're adding their own visual stimulation to help themselves calm. Is that accurate?
Yes. The problem is that it's an unusual behavior.
Right.
So when people see this, what we call self-regulating behavior,
Right.
it doesn't fit within the norm of regulation.
Right, right, yes. And you've mentioned an important concept then, that self-regulating behavior, because that's what we're all doing all the time with our sensory system.
Absolutely.
Is self-regulating. But what you're pointing out is that that's a different behavior, and it's not a common one, and that can be perceived as a problem then.
Correct.
Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, so we've covered auditory, we've covered vision, and so next we would talk about what?
I think we're on olfactory smell.
Okay, very
Okay,
good.
so that has to do with the nasal cavity, structures of the
sure.
nasal, and it's taking in all the smells that are in your environment. Olfactory is a difficult sensory system to determine if there's a problem. And what we'll find from characteristically is we may have an individual who likes to smell you before they get near you.
Right.
And I had an individual, a young lady who, this is how she would greet people, is she would smell your underarms. And she would,
That would be a difficult behavior.
and so you had to stand still, and then she would
Yes.
smell your underarms, and then she would decide if you were okay.
Yes.
And that's
right.
how she would determine who are the people that she was going to interact with. So sometimes you can tell by the smelling of hair, or, you know, and if a person talk about perfumes or colognes,
Right.
that's something that was unpleasant. But it even can be shampoos, any kind of body soap of any sort can also be.
Lotion.
Absolutely, can also be a
Right,
turnoff.
right. I've been to conferences, and in the conference program when you signed up, it said please limit or do not use fragrant lotions and perfumes because they were sensitive to the sensory sensitivities of the participants who were going to be coming to the conference.
And this does impact also their experiences in the community. So there may be places they can't go to.
Right.
Like
Right.
like a particular store or a particular restaurant. But also, Donna, there also can be calming
Right.
essences that
Yes.
can help. Natural essences like the smell of pine or natural flowers. Those can also be calming, so you can use it as a really powerful tool.
Right, right. And so what we're getting an idea of here is just how complex our sensory systems are.
Yes.
And how individual our responses are to sensory stimuli too. So I can see how complex this whole issue can be.
And if you do have an olfactory sensitivity to a particular smell, then you can take control of that by leaving the room or not
Right.
being in that area where the smell is.
Yes, yes. Actually, I have a colleague, and we would have all-day meetings, and so we would choose to have lunch together. We would have lunch brought in, and if it was pizza, he said, "If you order pizza, I have to leave." And he would.
Absolutely.
I mean, so no, it won't be pizza. We promise it won't be pizza, Mike.
Yes.
You know, because his response to pizza was that strong. Yeah, that olfactory sense was that strong for him. Okay, so now we're going to go on to what our next, or have we talked about some of the behaviors that we might see?
Yes, we've talked about a number of things.
Okay, yes, we did. All right, we can go on then.
So we'll go to gustatory or taste.
All right,
Again,
yes.
another powerful system that is definitely located in the mouth on various surfaces, the back of the mouth, the tongue, etc. And it's really stimulated by the chemicals in foods. So again, it's one of those sensory systems that all of us have likes and dislikes.
Right.
And one of the things we may find is that individuals may explore their environment by putting everything in their mouth.
Yes.
And it could be edible items, things that you can, should be
Right.
food items, or sometimes it can be inedible items like, you know, rocks or dirt or stones. And many families have reported that when their child is young, they like to eat dirt.
Right. Yes.
And so it can be a number of things, and they're getting some kind of sensation from whatever they're putting into their mouth.
Well, and we see this as a normal behavior in babies as they begin to explore their world.
Absolutely.
Too, is through
It's
taste.
putting everything into their mouth to see what it's like.
Yes.
You also may find that they prefer certain kinds of foods over others. And so many of our children will prefer, let's say, things that are very salty, crunchy,
Yes.
or sweet and smooth. But also gustatory can also be influenced by what we call the tactile system. That is how food feels in our mouth.
Exactly.
And
Right.
the proprioceptive system, how food feels when I'm chewing on it and providing pressure on it. And
I
we'll
see.
talk a little bit more about that. when we
Right,
get to
right. So we're seeing how
proprioception.
the senses work together. And taste and smell are two senses that work together as
Absolutely.
well. And we do know that there are a number of children that can have very strong sensory preferences around food and have make very restrictive
Yes.
food choices.
Yes.
Well, and sometimes even based on color.
Yes.
I've had parents tell me he only eats white food.
Correct.
You know,
or
so we're not
orange
talking about
food.
taste. We're talking about the vision there. But
And remember, your sensory systems work together.
sure.
To help understand them, separating them out is an easier way, but they oftentimes work
Right.
together.
Sure.
So don't, you have to really be exploring all the sensory systems.
Yes, have to be aware of all of that. Okay, so, and then the last of our 5 familiar
Yes.
senses.
It's going to be our tactile touch. And again, it is your skin.
Yes,
So you have more sensitive areas than others. So your feet, your hands that are going to be more sensitive to touch. And it really is any kind of vibration, pressure, any kind of contact. So you may find that some individuals love a deep hug, where another individual just likes the light caressing of the skin. And so they're
Right.
going to respond in different ways. And we have 2 systems. We have a system we're born with called the protective system. And it actually alerts us to danger. And it's something that you're born with. The second is the discriminative
yes,
system, and that is something that matures with you. And when we talk about behaviors that you might observe, we sort of look at it in a couple of different ways. So you may have individuals who are extremely hyperactive, extremely distractible, and that they can't focus, they can't attend, they need to move frequently. They're fearful of touch. They're fearful of people getting too close to them. They're very specific about what touch they want. But this also affects their socialness, because they also are fearful of people getting too close to them.
right, right.
Because they're fearful that they may touch them. So you might take your child to the playground and find that they isolate themselves, not because they don't want to enjoy the playground activities, but they're fearful of people around them.
Right, right. And we've heard the phrase tactily defensive,
Yes.
meaning kind of fearful of touch.
Exactly. And it can be extreme.
Yes, yes,
can be extreme.
And I have worked with kids too that that we had to think about. They either had to go to the cafeteria first to get their food, because just that standing in line and the jostling around was too distracting, and that made them too fearful, and they couldn't eat. So they couldn't relax because their fear of touch was so strong, of just being jostled, of just being
Yes.
being out of control.
And again, remember, you're going to have over hyper or under hypo.
Right.
So you're going
Right.
to, so to any of these actual sense of touch, you may have some of those responses. And that's why we oftentimes find that individuals won't wear glasses if they need them, or hearing aids, let's say, if they are required. Can often be very disorganized, because again, once that touch occurs, they begin to fall apart.
Oh, and I have also worked with kids who wanted to be touched. I mean, they hugged you so hard it hurt. As soon as they saw you, it was a cue to them to run up and just squeeze you really hard, to give you a really hard hug. And they wanted that much stimulation, that kind of tight hug. And I think that's also kind of connected to the tight vest, or some kids prefer tight clothes.
Exactly. And certainly there are some good interventions that have to do with things like a body sock, or
Right.
some weighted item that they would place on their lap or around their shoulders.
Right.
So it just, again, we're always trying to get that sensory system into balance, and the tactile is very powerful. Sometimes we refer to it as one of our power senses.
Is that right?
Yep.
Okay, so now we've been through the 5 familiar ones, haven't we?
Yes.
Now let's talk about those with the big words, okay, and the strange words to us. Okay, this one, proprioception.
So proprioception in space, it's really the input that you get through the joints, muscles, and tendons. So it's also movement that provides you with an idea of where your body is in space.
Right.
So it responds to bending and pushing and pulling, all those kinds of activities. And as we grow, our proprioception changes. So when we're little guys, we are crawling, and so we're feeling this proprioception through our knees and our feet and our shoulders. And as we become upright and walk, we feel it through our legs, and we always know where we are,
Right.
because of proprioception. And what we find is for individuals who have difficulty, it may be that they tend to be clumsy, and they tend to fall out, or they walk really hard and placing their foot really hard on the ground, so they can really feel
Right.
that input through their muscles, tendons, and joints. They may have some funny body posturing that they're not aware of, because their proprioception system is not giving them information as to where their leg or their arm or their hand might be. They'll have lots of difficulty often in manipulating items and objects. Small things like buttons or snaps may be difficult. And you'll find they'll be very resistant to new motor activities. So something they're not prepared for in advance, because they don't know how to organize their proprioception.
I see.
To help
so
them.
the resistance to maybe participating in an activity on the playground is not being non-compliant or not being antisocial. It's I don't feel safe.
Yes, and I don't know what to do either. So I may have difficulty in putting movements together like the other
Right.
individuals that
Right.
I'm with. It also is going to affect their work in school. So things like handwriting,
Right.
art projects, those can be difficult. So it may be that the child is responding in the art class to the actual activity because of their proprioceptive system. Also could be tactile.
Sure, it could. I mean, here's where we see this interaction.
Exactly.
And where you have to be a good kind of detective, I
Correct,
think, and you
correct.
have to observe very closely and attend, because the child's giving you clues. It's up to the adults around that child to interpret those clues.
Exactly.
Right. So that's proprioception.
That's proprioception.
That was a really difficult concept for me to get my mind around when I first learned it too. I just thought, it didn't quite speak to me. And but one of the best examples that someone gave to me was said, when you're maybe doing something else and you pick up a glass and you take a drink and you put the glass down, but you put it down a lot harder than you think. It's kind of that it's been that your body hasn't told you exactly where your hand was in space. You kind of expected the table to be lower than it was, or whatever. These kind of things that we do unconsciously.
Or steps.
Yes.
Steps have a certain height.
Right.
So if you're on steps that are either too high or too low,
Yes.
you have a misstep. But it's also interesting, because when you use the glass of water example, so from proprioception that when you pick up a glass that's full of water,
Right.
you have to grasp that glass stronger and with more power, and when that's empty, it doesn't require you to have to
Right.
grab onto it so tightly.
Right.
So think if I have a proprioception issue, there's so many things I struggle doing.
Yes, right, yeah.
Holding eating utensils. I mean, there's just so many different things that we take for granted. Walking backwards, something we can do. We don't have to look behind us. We just know when we move our foot back, we feel the input, usually toe heel, and we know what to do.
Yes. Okay. So we're getting some clear ideas of just about how complex our sensory system is. So that's proprioception.
Yes.
Proprioception. Now let's talk about the other unfamiliar one. Not that it's unfamiliar to us in terms of experience, because we all experience all of these, but in terms of the name.
So vestibular
Yes.
is our most powerful sensory system, and it has to do with what we call our balance system in our ear, the semicircular canals, and head movement.
Right.
So think about getting onto a roller coaster. Your vestibular system is helping you, once you get off of that roller coaster, to right your body back into that balance system, that homeostasis.
Right.
And it gives us information about, also, like proprioception, where we are in space and time. But it's a very powerful system, because what we see when we have difficulties with individuals with vestibular is, again, if we want to go through our over or under, we'll start with our hypersensitive or over. Those are the individuals who are fearful of movement at all.
Okay.
So they are uncomfortable in just moving and walking. They may not run. They're not comfortable in running. They're definitely not going to put themselves in any kind of spinning or circular motions. They, again, can appear clumsy, but they want to be grounded. They want their feet on the ground. Sometimes we see children who have to take those shoes and socks off so they can really feel input through their feet and stay solidly. So those are for the overactive vestibular system. For those under or hypersensitive, they have to seek movement, and oftentimes it's aggressive. So you may have a child, for example, that I've experienced who could spin for 45 minutes before they'd stop.
Wow.
And I would think, if any of us were to do it, we'd be dizzy and fall. She was able to right herself immediately after 45 minutes spinning in a circle. So they're actively seeking movement as much as they can. So there's a young man, sort of well known in Cleveland, who loves to go to Cedar Point. And he has a free pass every summer. And his favorite ride is that one that floor drops out.
Yes.
And he gets on that thing, and he does it every day in the summertime with his free pass. And he goes round and round and round and round and round, and the floor drops out, and it's just the most exciting thing to him. And he's been doing it for years.
Wow.
So that would be an undersensitive vestibular system that needs to be stimulated.
Okay. Okay, so that's the seven senses that you've talked about. You've talked about how they do work together.
Yes.
You've also talked about this concept of hypo, which is undersensitive, and hyper, which is oversensitive. Can you talk? Does that operate with all of our senses, or just certain senses?
Yes.
Or
you can be over or undersensitive, or over or understimulated with any of the senses. It's going to be based on how you're put together.
Okay. Okay. So it's kind of like a part of who you are as an individual.
Exactly.
Is what it is. Might your level of sensitivity change? Say, if you get more anxious, might you be more sensitive to something that you might be able to tolerate if you were?
Well, absolutely. And I always like to think of my sensory systems and how they react and respond to, how I'm feeling overall, or the circumstances or the environments that I'm in. And I sometimes think, if we think about how we respond, think about how the individual who's got sensory processing disorder is responding to their environment. So we all are affected by the environment, our community, about thoughts in our mind about things that are happening. If we're anxious, or we're frustrated, or we're feeling low about something, we will feel different.
Right. And the other thing that says to me, too, is having to kind of, when our sensory systems are challenged, what that's going to do is raise our level of anxiety, because there's an issue of safety here. It speaks to me of safety in terms of keeping our sensory systems in balance. Balance to us means safety, because what we're seeking is that sense of balance and safety. And if it's challenged, we're going to feel less safe, and that increases our level of anxiety, which would impact.
Sure. And so for some individuals, they'll retreat, and for other individuals, they'll act out.
Right.
And so sometimes people, again, misinterpret that the behavior is really a reflection of a sensory need.
Right, right. And certainly being in education and talking with parents and working with parents, one of their major concerns often is behavior. And we talk about behaviors. And we think of behavior as either a child does what we want them to do, or what we think we've taught them to do. And if they don't, we can label it as a behavior, and maybe respond to it in a way that doesn't look at what's causing that behavior. Why does that behavior feel necessary for that child? And I think understanding the sensory system speaks to the fact that you have to explore why a child is behaving in the way the child is behaving, rather than assuming that it is this issue of noncompliance, I think.
Correct. Well, and again, behavior is communication.
Right.
You have to figure out what the communication is about. So it could be about a sensory need.
Right.
And the sensory need could be pushing away, or gravitating towards. So we always want to think about that when you're starting to look at the purpose of behavior.
Right, right. Now, the one thing I do want to be clear about is that we've talked about how complex the sensory system is. And if you observe some of the behaviors, as a parent, if you observe some of the behaviors that you have identified, and you think that what your child may be dealing with would be a series of sensory challenges, what should you do in that case?
Well, I think the best thing to do is to seek out the services of an occupational therapist or an OT. Because as a parent, you can provide information as to what you're observing. And if your child is in school, you can also get information from the school staff as to what they're observing. And then the occupational therapist can put the information together, do an assessment and evaluation, and then come up with some thoughts about the sensory processing disorder. Because many, many, many individuals with special needs have sensory processing disorder.
Right.
And it can be at different levels. It can be subtle, or it can be more extreme.
Right. And so that occupational therapist can guide probably an entire team in doing the kind of exploration they need and taking the data they need in terms of observing the behaviors in certain situations to then develop a plan.
And then once the plan's developed and then implemented with interventions, then the occupational therapist will provide a way to get data on what is being successful.
Right.
And that's where it's important, because there are certain kinds of sensory interventions that need to be monitored by the occupational therapist, with input from family, staff, who's ever involved with the individual.
Right, right. So at a certain level, you're going to need to check in with an occupational therapist and have a full sensory assessment and be guided in terms of your sensory interventions, both at school and at home.
Yes.
Yeah, with the support of an occupational therapist. But then all of us can have certain sensory issues at different, at different times. And I know that you prepared some kind of basic interventions for us that we have attached here to this Third Thursday broadcast. And it's a separate PowerPoint that just speaks about interventions. Do you think you could review some of these interventions that parents could implement in the home? I know I was just really impressed with how creative and how common some of them were.
What you want to look at when you start looking at interventions and strategies is you want to put together something that's age appropriate to the individual. So our younger children oftentimes can engage in activities that are considered more playful than our older students, or our older individuals.
Yes.
So they may be engaged in things like jumping on trampolines and maybe using some fidgets to help them to manipulate. Where our older individuals, you want to give them things that may require a job or some responsibilities. So when we look at strategies, there are a number of things. And if you'd like me to, Donna, we go through a few things on this.
Yeah, I would like for you to do that, because the parents will have this PowerPoint themselves.
Okay.
So they'll be able to see it.
So the auditory system, basically, if you have an individual that you suspect may be responding to sounds, is you might want to start thinking about, when is the individual the most calm? So are they most calm listening to certain kind of music? Are they most calm when they are exposed to things like white noise or very continuous sounds? So you want to consider the environments where they feel the best and look the most balanced.
Right.
You may want to consider headphones or earplugs of any sort that they can utilize. You also might think, if you're going out into the community, that you might want to provide them with something to wear in their ear. But I would just caution in saying, make it something that is fairly invisible. Not going out with the big headphones on in the communities.
Yes. We don't want to make people look so different.
Exactly. So that could be, very simple, some auditory strategies. From the visual perspective, you want to have visual supports available. Because visual supports will provide that very specific guidance without a lot of redirection verbally. Because a lot of times our individuals, particularly with autism, have very strong visual sense. So visual supports can be extremely helpful. Sometimes if you're working on homework, let's say, you can provide them with an incline board. So it's a board that's about 45 degrees at angle. And then you can put the work on that board, and that helps to give you a little bit of a different visual, spatial look at the materials that they're doing. So that can be very helpful, elevating material. And I also think the organization of the environment is very crucial.
For the visual particularly, yes.
So it's organized, they know where things are, they know where to get them, and there's no surprises.
Right.
For gustatory,
Yes.
obviously, you want to know what are the foods that the individual likes. But because many of our individuals who have gustatory issues have limited diets, you want to create a very relaxed environment during your meal times. So at home, you want everybody to be sitting at the table. You want to always have a food in front of the child that they can eat.
That you already know that they like.
Exactly.
Yes.
And then you can explore some other kinds of food options. And so maybe you have sibling to sibling passing food, and everybody sort of trying some new food textures. You might want to play some calming music so it makes it a very comfortable time, because unfortunately, when you have gustatory issues, mealtime can be very chaotic.
Right.
You don't want to force an individual to eat anything that they don't like, but if you're enjoying the environment, you're having conversation, you're talking about food, it may encourage them to maybe try a taste.
Right.
Even get it to their nose to smell it. So you want to make it a pleasant environment. That's
Right.
really a crucial piece.
Yes, I noticed that one of your suggestions was to communicate about food.
Yes.
Not only with the child, but with each other, with other siblings. That food is something that you talk about. Its smell, its flavor, its texture.
It's really, and you're just talking about it. You could also attempt to get them to help you prepare food before dinner. So maybe they're getting their hands in the food and they're touching it and they're exploring it a little bit. Again, it may not encourage them as much to put it in their mouth, but at least you're beginning to just not make food the focus of your meal times.
Right. Yes. Yes.
For the olfactory system, obviously you want to be sensitive to smell. So again, you ask yourself the question: when is the child most distracted, and could it be potentially some smell? So it might be something specific you're cooking, and you just find that your child looks very agitated. So maybe it's what you're cooking. Like I always think broccoli, which is such a great food, when it's cooking, doesn't smell so good.
Yeah, talk to my son about that.
Yes, has a very strong odor to it.
Right.
So you want to sort of get an idea of that, and then again, you want to prepare the individual about the smell that they're going to be getting ready. You're going to be ready to introduce into the environment. You want to be careful of the kinds of shampoos and laundry detergent and the kinds of things that you're using. I've had incidences where there has been a child who was acting up at school and nobody could figure out why, and we found out through some information from the family that they had changed the softener for the clothes.
Right.
And that was, and once they went back to the old softener for the clothes softener, the problems disappeared. So you want to really sort of look at the environment and saying, what do I see changes, and could it be a smell?
Right.
And then, of course, personally, you want to watch the kinds of smells. Like, I have very few individuals I know, parents particularly, who wear perfumes. They're very conscientious. You also want to look at the tactile touch.
Right.
Again, you want to get some strategies that have to do with calming, and if, for example, with tactile and/or proprioceptive. And as I said before, a lot of individuals respond to the deep hug, the deep pressure,
Right.
Where others respond more to light touch. So you got to have to understand, exactly what touch does the individual respond to. You want to think about some calming areas in your home that the child can go to, that it's just their place. It can be a bedroom, but sometimes we've organized them like in a rec room or in a family room, and it's just a little escape like a tent, and it has some items and objects in there that are very calming.
Right here. And you're making this connection again between sensory and anxiety or lack of anxiety, or what can help relieve anxiety too, in terms of creating a calming space.
So that can be a nice way to do it. You also may consider having certain kinds of pieces of equipment. So you might have a small trampoline or a bouncing ball that the individual can get on. I know a lot of families will have the big trampolines outside, and those can be also something that you can utilize. You want to keep things pretty organized when you start thinking about these power senses, tactile, proprioceptive, vestibular. You want to have some kind of routine. Doesn't have to be a strict routine like school, let's say, or work, but it could be just a routine that when the child gets home, they get to have a snack.
Right.
And then they get to do 20 minutes of something they love to do, and then maybe they sit down and do a homework activity. Or they go to the kitchen and help you with a task. Or they have a job. And their jobs can be things that have to do with, you know, maybe heavy work. So maybe they're always responsible to push the broom after or do the vacuuming.
Right.
If they don't have an auditory sensitivity to a vacuum.
Yes, right.
So you have a number of things that can be utilized in the home as well as school that are based on the sensory needs of the individual.
Okay. All right. Well, and we will include that PowerPoint as part of our resources for this third Thursday. We've also got an overview of the sensory system from the book Asperger's Syndrome and the Sensory System by Brenda Smith Miles, which is just a really quick kind of cheat sheet on all of the senses, kind of the things that we went over with this PowerPoint. And we've also included this PowerPoint as one of our resources. I would also encourage parents to go to the OCALI Lending Library and put in the search box sensory, and you can see all of the books that we have, books and DVDs on sensory processing that you would be able to check out to learn more about the sensory system. Denise, thank you for being here, for teaching us
You're
about
welcome.
the sensory
You're
system. I
welcome.
really appreciate it. And thank you for joining us for this third Thursday.